Hello, this is John Robles. I'm speaking with Mr. Rick Rozoff, the owner and manager of the Stop NATO website and international mailing list. He's also a regular contributor to the Voice of Russia and a geopolitical specialist. How are you this afternoon or evening over there?
It's evening here in Chicago. I'm doing fine. Yourself too, I hope.
Again, you were ahead of the curve and ahead of the times here. I'm talking about Rocky Balboa and the new government lineup for Ukraine, and I'd like to get your comments on that, and if possible, Victoria Nuland's, staged conversation, or what was it? What's going on over there?
It's yet to be determined the exact nature of the conversation. What appears to be indisputable, however, is that U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, Victoria Nuland, had a conversation, the real question is when, but had a recent conversation with U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine in Kiev, one Jeffrey Piat, P-Y-A-T-T. And during this discussion, they very matter-of-factly, almost mundanely, discussed who would constitute a new Ukrainian government, presumably post-Yanukovych, or at least transitionally. There's some speculation that the conversation may have been held not during Ms. Nuland's current stay in the Ukraine. She arrived there on the 6th of February, but perhaps earlier in January 25th. But whenever the conversation occurred, what is remarkable about it is the absolute cynicism. The notion that the Secretary of State could determine who is the most likely person to be, say, Prime Minister or Deputy Prime Minister of a sovereign nation, Ukraine.
So the conversation was with the ambassador to Ukraine. What were they discussing?
Well, there's no room for opinion. It was blunt and irrefutable what they were discussing, which was what the future Ukrainian government would look like. And what Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland and U.S. Envoy Jeffrey Piat were talking about, which is determining amongst themselves which of the three major opposition leaders would occupy key posts within the government, a future government to the U.S.'s liking and perhaps the U.S.'s design, and which would remain outside the government as an opposition figure. But it was not a matter of expressing opinions on this. The conversation which I've heard, I imagine many of your listeners have, is clearly one where the stage director is giving cues to the actors. And it's understood that Arseny Yatsenchuk, who's the head of the Fatherland Party, would become presumably a prime minister either under a Yanukovych government, a unity government, if you will, or at post-Yanukovych, but that Vitaly Klitschko and the head of Svoboda Party would remain outside the government. That's what Nuland was, I don't even think so much recommending, but dictating.
They were planning the makeup of the Ukrainian government amongst themselves?
I would even say the word ordering the composition of the next government would not have been an overstatement. Mm-hmm. By the way, the U.S. ambassador clearly was taking his orders from Nuland. Nuland is Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, and he, being an ambassador, of course, works for the State Department and works for her. We have to remember, of course, Victoria Nuland was State Department spokesman under John Kerry's predecessor, Hillary Clinton, and was herself, under the George W. Bush administration, a U.S. permanent representative, which is, say, an ambassador to NATO. So she's somebody who's, pretty high-level operative and has focused on Eurasia, but most particularly former Soviet space. And it's to be assumed that Mr. Piat, about whom I know nothing else, that is the ambassador in Ukraine, may very well be someone comparable to the Michael McFaul, who's now leaving the ambassadorial post in Moscow, somebody who you were the first to recognize, at his proper value when he arrived, as somebody with no diplomatic experience or training, but someone who is very adept at sponsoring so-called color revolutions. And I assume Mr. Piat in Kiev is somebody of the same stripe.
I think Ukraine is the color revolution playground for the U.S. State Department. I don't know. Do you think this may have been a staged leak to try to show that there's no real support for Klitschko? Because maybe that was hurting his chances in Ukraine. Maybe he was even possibly facing treason charges or something if he was seen as being their puppet in Ukraine.
That's a technique that has been employed before, where you give the impression of putting distance between yourself and a client so as to boost the independent credentials of that client. I can't rule out the possibility that's true.
Was Russia mentioned in this conversation at all?
Yes. Nuland indicated to her underling, I suppose we'd have to say, Pyatt, the ambassador in Ukraine, U.S. ambassador in Ukraine, that when she made the infamous statement about, the expletive telling the European Union what to do, I assume your listeners probably know what I'm talking about. The indication was that she could count on support from the United Nations, that is from Ban Ki-moon, and a Dutch diplomat working for the United Nations, one I'm going to pronounce it the English manner, Robert Serry, S-E-R-R-Y, that they would come in and, in the words of Nuland, glue this together, or words to that effect, and that the EU, presumably, she wasn't quite explicit about this, wasn't moving fast enough for political, for regime change in Kiev, and that she felt it was imperative that the pace, I suppose, of the color revolution be stepped up, because otherwise Russia might be able to intervene and counteract or act against, rather, some of the momentum that was building up in the street. So she clearly indicated this was, in opposition to Russian actions and, clearly, implicitly in opposition to Russian interests.
I see. So she used the expletive because the EU was not moving quickly enough for her.
Right, but these are comparatively minor tactical differences, I suppose. One has to keep in mind that she, Nuland, came back to Kiev a second time. This is the same woman who was handing out pastries and cookies to protesters in Maidan and Independence Square and elsewhere in Ukraine, so openly and one-sidedly sympathizing with anti-government protesters. The protesters is a euphemistic term, I think, members of an uprising, a violent uprising, and was succoring them, was giving them aid, support, moral and material. And that she came back on February 6th to meet with this triumvirate of opposition leaders that we've talked about. Nuland met with them yesterday, and then Catherine Ashton from the European Union came in exactly the same time to meet with exactly the same three leaders. So there's every reason to believe what Ashton and Nuland are doing now is what they've been doing all along, which is acting in unison, acting in tandem.
I said before you were ahead of the curve again. We mentioned last time we talked about Ukraine, pretty much kind of out of the blue, Rocky Balboa, or Sylvester Stallone's role, right? Now, can you tell our listeners about this picture that's been spread around on the internet, and what's all that about?
I have to give you the credit. I think you first conjured up the image of Sylvester Stallone's cinema alter ego, Rocky Balboa, in reference to Vladimir Vitaly Klitschko. But what in fact surfaced today, and we were able to circulate it a bit, is a photograph from 2011 of Sylvester Stallone with the Klitschko brothers. Altogether, the five people in the photograph, at least two of them are Klitschko brothers, one of them Vitaly, to announce the launching of Rocky the Musical, I swear to God. Rocky the Musical.
Rocky the Musical?
Rocky the Musical, which was to have been launched, I suppose it was, the following year, 2012. And in the background, the print is in German, so I assume this event was staged in Germany. But it was clearly the fictional Rocky Rambo, as we talked about in your program, if you'll recollect. A Sylvester Stallone composite creature who is, anti-Russian guerrilla warfighter par excellence, and Rocky IV, who wins boxing matches against Russian boxers and so forth. So this is, the kind of crudely crafted image that's being passed off as politics. The third figure in this category, I suppose, would be somebody like Arnold Schwarzenegger. And I've been trying to find a photograph of the three together. I believe one exists, by the way, if some of you listeners want to try to hunt it up, of Klitschko, Stallone, and Schwarzenegger together. This would be the image of politics as they're trying to pass it off to a certain sector of the Ukrainian populace. I don't think too successfully.
Is Sylvester Stallone popular in Ukraine? I don't think so. I don't know.
I can't imagine that he is. But I think that Klitschko may very well be trying to model himself after not the real world Sly Stallone, but after the cinema fantasies of a combination again of Rocky and Rambo, and this may be an image crafted by perhaps some overpaid but not particularly creative or innovative public relations firms that have been hired to support the Orange Revolution Phase 2.
So we have the U.S. State Department now openly, now it's clear. I mean, we've been talking about it, but now we have evidence, and it's perfectly out there. It's clear that they're actually assigning leaders to countries. Would it be fair to characterize it like that?
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. And it's not dissimilar, too, as you've made the allusion to the original so-called Orange Revolution.
So, Rick, unprecedented, I think, statements, but maybe they're planted statements. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Again, we're talking about the Nuland-Pyatt dialogue.
Right.
I mean, one never knows. But I'll say this. that the fact that Victoria Nuland apologized to the European Union suggests that she is part of the game if it's a ploy, and if it's genuine, she has just acknowledged that's her voice and that's precisely what she said, obscenity and all. As has been pointed out by other observers, the apologies ought not to be extended to the European Union. The apologies, if we were in a better world, would be extended to the government and the people of Ukraine, who she is attempting to ride roughshod over, and to implant a U.S.-designed proxy or quizzling government in the stead of that elected legally 4 years ago in Ukraine, so that that's where the apology ought to be. But, one thing, too, that it's a case where perhaps it's fortunate she used the infamous four-letter word she did, because as a result of it, the audio tape has now achieved a degree of exposure and circulation I'm sure it would not have otherwise, although the content of it is historically almost unprecedented. And if we take it at face value, for the first time, a major U.S. official is explaining precisely how they institute a government change, a regime change, a coup, in fact, and is boasting of it or discussing it in detail before the fact. This is something that wasn't available in Iran in 1953 or Guatemala in 54 or Iraq in 63 or the Belgian Congo in the 60s. This is something, an historical artifact that really needs to be paid attention to.
Do you think it's possible this is just another distractor from the Sochi Olympics, or?
Well, the timing of it certainly is suspect, that much I grant. And we have to maybe take the next chapter in this story, which is that a State Department spokesperson, one Jen Psaki, Jen I presume is short for Jennifer, refers to the fact that ostensibly, supposedly, this audio tape was revealed to the world, posted on YouTube or what have you, by a Russian official. Feeds right into the mounting Russophobic campaign that is being built up right now. And as a matter of fact, in the words of the State Department spokesman Psaki, this is a new low. That's a quote from her. A new low. That is, even assuming this is the case, that a Russian official has released the audio tape, how he obtained it is, begs questioning, of course. But that even if that were true, to suggest something as innocuous as that is offends the State Department, when State Department members, heads rather, like, Nuland herself, no less, right, her attitude towards the European Union seems to be a new low. But former boss Hillary Clinton, constantly berating Russia, saying Russia and China have got to pay a price. Position towards Syria, using words like despicable and so forth to talk about those partners. Low is what the State Department practices on an ongoing basis. But the fact that it's again being used, like you say, on the occasion of the opening ceremonies of the Winter Olympics in Sochi in Russia, suggests that this is part of yet another attempt to discredit Russia, rather than looking at the context of the discussion itself, which ought to be enough to disgrace the United States, at least what claims to be its diplomatic wing for come.
Did anybody offer any evidence that it came from Russia, or is this just they're again demonizing Russia as usual?
Yeah, but at a very sensitive moment when Russia is likely the center of world attention with the opening of the Winter Olympics, and this is not at all different than, for example, the fact that the U.S.-backed Saakashvili regime, attacked South Ossetia and triggered a 5-day war with Russia in August of 2008, exactly as the Summer Olympics in Beijing were open.
Okay, Rick, thank you very much. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with me.
Okay.
Take care. Bye. That was the end of an interview with Rick Rozoff, the owner and manager of the Stop NATO website and international mailing list. You can find the rest of this interview on our website at voiceofrussia.com. Thank you very much for listening, and as always, I wish you the best wherever you may be.